All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Today we have a webinar about English composition skills for examination writing. Okay, so as parents, many of us know that composition writing can be a real challenge and sometimes a frustration for our children, especially when they have really good ideas, but they struggle to put their thoughts onto the paper. So today we're actually going to look at some practical ways to help students write stronger, more engaging PSLE compositions and understand exactly what examiners are actually looking for. All right, so thank you once again for joining me this afternoon. Okay, so let's get started now. By the way, my name is Hugh, and I'm the head of curriculum and teaching at the Eton Academy. All right, so for me, I was actually an ex-MOE senior teacher, and I've been teaching for more than 25 years. All right. So in terms of going through the PSLE part of this of your students' career, I've quite an extensive knowledge of that. Okay. I have prepared many PSLE classes, and I've also marked PSLE scripts. Okay, so whatever I'm sharing with you comes from experience in marking PSLE and also in preparing students to take the PSLE. Okay. Now, one thing I've always observed is that students improve most when they understand exactly what good writing is, right? What they need to do to ensure that their script is considered a good piece of writing. Okay. It's not about memorizing phrases. And I think sometimes as parents, um, uh, there's this tendency to tell your children to, okay, please memorize all these good phrases and use them in your stories. While good phrases does help sometimes, what's more important is for them to understand how it helps and using them accurately. You don't want a situation where students are just memorizing phrases and putting them in a story when actually perhaps these phrases don't really fit the whole storyline. Okay, and I've seen a lot of that as well. Okay, so that's why it's about understanding more than anything else. Okay, right. So let's move on from here. Okay, so maybe one question for you to think about. What feedback has your has your child's English teacher shared about his or her progress in writing? Okay, so what kind of feedback has the teacher shared? Okay, so there are some very common points, right? For example, things like my child struggles. Oh, sorry, let me just go back there. Oh, let me try that again. Yeah, here we go. Okay, my child struggles with expressing his or her story ideas. Okay, so that is one of the issues that some parents hear, right, from the teachers, all right? Yeah, this is a very common one. Child's composition not developed. Okay, so again, good writing, there's lots of development in the story. Okay. What I feel is that many students don't know how to develop, right? So when you get feedback like, oh, the story is not developed, the next question you should be asking is, okay, so how do I actually make this better? How do I develop? Right? And we're going to talk about that later on today as well. Okay. Yeah, my child's stories are out of point. There is a possibility that they misunderstand the question, they misunderstand the task. So again, what we need to do is to analyze what is supposed to be written, break it down, and then from there, once there's a clear understanding, the story shouldn't be out of point, right? Mm, language score brings the overall score down. Okay, so as I'll share shortly, the composition is marked in two so-called two parts, right? One is content, which is your story idea, and the other component, of course, is language. So these are two separate components, but when they mark it, obviously it's a holistic way of marking, right? So language does play a part in getting a good score as well. Okay. Yeah, and of course, the last one is just about content, so your story ideas. Okay, so let's go uh deeper into this. Now, before we analyze the stories themselves or talk about compositions, there has been a change in the way the PSLE is marked, and this change started last year. Okay. Now, before the overall percentage for composition was 27.5%. Okay, but last year it was reduced slightly to 25%. Okay, so if your child is taking PSLE this year or in the next few years, it will remain as 25%. Okay, the total mark therefore is brought down from 55 to 50. Now, for composition writing, there are actually two components. Okay, the first component is actually what we call situational writing. Now, again, if you have seen your child's work, let's say your child's already in primary five, they would have already encountered situational writing. This is new to primary five. In primary four, some schools might do something similar, but they probably will not call it situational writing. Okay. Basically, what is situational writing? It's where the student is asked to write, for example, an email or perhaps a report or maybe a notice. So these are like practical pieces of writing, right? And they'll be given a task. They'll tell you exactly what you need, what are the things, what is the information they need to include in that task, right? So this is the first component, and this is actually in the past, it was worth 15 marks, right? 6 marks for the task fulfillment and 9 marks for language. But since last year, it has dropped 1 mark to 14 marks. So it's 6 marks for task fulfillment and 8 marks now for language. So it's just a slight adjustment, okay, in terms of the marks, all right? So you can see on the screen here, this is just a rough rubric that is used to award the marks, right? So task fulfillment, a total of 6 marks. So what does that mean? Basically, they'll tell you what information they need the student to include, and this is all based on something that they give, a scenario that they give, and it's fairly straightforward in the sense that all the information can be found in that text, or rather in that situation. Okay. However, okay, sorry, before that, language as well. So language upon 8 marks. Basically, again, these are all in different bands. So if let's say your child has good sequencing, uses some varied vocabulary, minimal mistakes, maybe you can make like just 1 or 2 minor mistakes, they can still get the highest band, which is 7 to 8 marks, right? Typically, most students, if they just follow the instructions well, they make minimal errors in terms of language, they can easily score from 12 to 14. All right. This is usually the case. The problem comes when they misunderstand the task. Okay. So the thing is that since last year, I mentioned earlier, right, there are 6 content points. And of that information can be found in the stimulus given. Okay, but since last year, there's one point where the student needs to actually come up with on his or her own, right? It has to be a logical piece of information. Okay, I'll show you an example very shortly. Okay, so this is the thing that's been changed since last year. So now not all the information can be found directly from the stimulus. There's one point that they need to actually come up with on their own. So this is what makes it a little more challenging ever since last year. Yeah. Now, on the screen, I hope you can see it. It's a little small, but maybe hopefully you're not using your phones. If you're using your phones, maybe it's a bit too small to see. But this is actually last year's PSLE question. Okay, so as you can see, there's a scenario going on. There's some people playing basketball, and basically it's about the Lucy and learning a new sport, right? And she's practicing, and in the end, she gets good at playing basketball. Okay, so that's the whole scenario. Okay, now the task itself is this, right? It says, imagine you're Lucy. So you have to take a role. You have to take this role of Lucy. And And if you sign off or if you indicate that you're not Lucy, that's where your child will lose marks as well. So you have to read the question really, really carefully. Okay. And it says here, write an article for the class notice board. So basically the task is to write an article. Okay, that is the task. Okay. And there are several points there, bulleted points, which is what your child needs to include in terms of the content. Yep. Now, the last point, as you can see here, it's underlined. So this is the point that the student needs to come up with his or her own idea, right? So in this case, it says, one way you have benefited from the sport. So this is not going to be clearly reflected in the stimulus, right? So what the student needs to come up with is something practical, something logical, basically, right? So if let's say it's playing a sport, maybe something like you can talk about exercise, you can talk about improving dexterity, things like that. Something that is practical and logical. Okay, so that's situational writing. And as I shared earlier, typically most students should be able to score between 12 to 14. In fact, there are many students who score full marks for this, right? As long as they understand the task and they're able to fulfill all the points, okay, with minimal language errors. Yep. Now, the bulk of the test is, of course, the continuous writing, which is the story writing, right? So, since last year again, all right, there isn't really a major change except that the total score previously was 40 marks. So 20 marks each for content and also 20 marks for language. It's been reduced slightly to 36 marks. So it's 18 for content and 18 for language now. Okay, so again, it's just more of the amount of marks. That's all. Okay, let me just show you very quickly. Yeah, so this is the rubrics of how they'll be graded. So the top band, 16 to 18. So as far as content is concerned, right, the content is well developed, interesting, very good sequencing of events, paragraphing. That's all. That will all come in under content. And for a top band for language, there's hardly any mistakes in grammar, spelling, punctuation, right? There is appropriate vocabulary and maybe even good vocabulary. So obviously, if the whole story is the students using really simple words, they won't score too well for language and organization. um, Variation in sentence structure, right? Different techniques used. So these are the things that will really boost their language. Okay. The thing is, however, language usually is very intertwined with content. So like the better words that your child uses, right? It actually evokes a stronger story, right? So it's really intertwined, and that's why I say that it's actually marked holistically. It's not separated as in content and then language 18, where like if the story is really interesting, but the language is really bad, they still can get a really high score. Not necessarily. Okay, there is a relation there. Okay, so I just want to very quickly go through examples of PSLE questions right now. So last year, okay, if you have not already seen, the question was about being thankful. So this again is the continuous writing part. I already showed you the situational writing earlier, yeah? So this is about being thankful. So being thankful is actually the theme of the composition for last year. Okay. And of course, there are a few questions there which they have to answer in their story. So the first question is, who was or were thankful? So it could be about more than one person, right? And how did the person or persons or people express thankfulness? Okay, so these are the two things that they have to actually include in their story. If let's say they don't include one of these points, again, their score will be affected, right? Usually the questions that they give are very general, and naturally, if you write a story, these questions would be answered. Okay, but it's also good for your children to take note, because just in case they miss something out, right? Okay, and to keep them on track. Okay. Um, right. So these were the pictures. Okay, so Again, for every composition writing, there will be three pictures given, and they do not need to use all the pictures, but they must use at least one picture, right? So that's really important. They have to use one of the pictures and relate it to the theme. Okay, so earlier I talked about understanding the theme. So they have to ask themselves what is the meaning of being thankful, and then look at the pictures and think which picture is is the one that they can write the most interesting story about in line with the theme. Yeah. Usually, for the PSLE, the pictures are very varied. So even if they wanted to use more than one picture, it can be a bit tough. So I always tell the students, don't worry about using all three pictures. There's no additional points. There's no additional marks they will give you if you decide to use all three pictures. You just need to concentrate on one, the one that they can write the most interesting story about. Okay. Now, bear in mind, of course, if it's in an exam situation, they have to think quickly. They can't ponder over it for too long, right? Because it's a timed exam, right? So this was the question last year. So you can see the first picture is a class party. The next one is a sunflower. So that's pretty open, right? And then the third one is a sign, is like a give way to the elderly or the pregnant and all that, right? Now, one important tip is that to use the picture effectively, they need to make sure that the story itself centers around the picture. Okay, so students shouldn't just mention the picture casually in the story. Then they're not really using the picture very well. The story itself should be based on the picture. Of course, also being aligned with the theme, right? So what I tell students is this, imagine if you remove the picture from your story, that story shouldn't exist anymore. It's not a story anymore. So the picture has to be that important. Okay. So that's just something for you to remember to tell your children as well. Right? Okay, now uh based on that on last year's question, right? So the important points to take note of, because it was about being thankful. So express what is the good deed or the kindness that was shown, right? Why was it important to the main character? And of course, how did the character show thankfulness? Okay. So these are the main points that good stories would include. Yeah. Okay. So some of the pitfalls are some of the things that students uh made mistakes with, right? So the first thing, because it's being thankful, right? Sometimes the act itself wasn't very significant. So in the sense that it was just a small thing. So if for example, let's say something like helping someone to pick something up or to clean up a mess, for example. I mean, yes, it is a kind thing which people will be thankful for, but it's not so significant. So what does that mean? It means that the interest value of the story is not very high, right? So that's the thing. The whatever the theme is, that has to be very strongly shown in the story. Okay, it has to mean something to the main character. Yeah. Uh, Also lack of development of characters showing gratitude. So again, being thankful. So it must be clear that the character is showing that he or she is very thankful, right? Another issue that some students encountered was that they had many small events of showing gratitude. So there was no one main issue, as it were. Okay. Later on, we'll talk about planning, and then one of the things in any story is having a form of a conflict, right? So there was no main conflict. Okay. So again, when that happens, the story becomes a bit disjointed, like there's no focal point. Okay, so these are the things just to take note of. Okay, I'll just very quickly show you some of the past previous years of PSLE as well. Then we'll move on to analyzing how to write the stories. Okay, so 2024, the question was trying something new. So again, it's about trying a new experience. and how it turned out. Okay, let me just show you the pictures for this one. Okay, so there was a open house, a CCA open house, a sandwich, and a campfire. So again, students could write about any one of these pictures as long as the focal point, or rather the focus was on one of these pictures, and it was the main part of the story. Okay. Okay, so here again, some of the pitfalls here, they students might forget to indicate that this is a new activity. They're so excited about going, for example, let's say they wrote about the one about camping. Maybe they just focus all their efforts on describing, what it was like, what they're experiencing. But because it's something new, trying something new, they have to mention that it's the first time they're doing it. So that's important. Okay, so again, students need to always go back to the theme to make sure that they are actually addressing the theme. Yeah. Sometimes as you've seen, right, the theme itself doesn't really give you a point of conflict. Now, in the past, it was much more straightforward, right? Because the stories were, I mean, the titles were things like shoplifting or a fight, something like that. So that was very obvious that the conflict, you know what the conflict was. But now it's a little more open. So sometimes students find it hard to come up with a conflict or a problem, as it were. So this is something they need to actually train to do, looking at different themes to think of something that creates conflict in the story. Okay. Yeah, it could be that conflict itself wasn't really related to what the new experience was in this example. Yeah. Okay, let me just move on. Okay, one more question from 2023, a change for the better. So this is the theme for that year. All right. So what was the change? What was done to make the change? And what kind of improvements did the change bring? So these were the guiding questions. Okay. So again, the guiding questions will help the students to focus, to plan out the story as well. Okay, and here are the pictures were, right? So there was a messy room, a girl jogging in the park, and you can just see a laptop. Now, usually, from what we've noticed over the last few years, one picture at least will be characters doing something, right? Another picture will be usually an object, and the third picture could be a scene of something. So usually it's like that. Okay. The one for sure is usually the characters doing something. So that's just for you to take note as well. Okay. Okay, so again, some common pitfalls here. Perhaps they didn't describe the situation before the change very well. Then they went straight into the change, and that again, that doesn't show how great the change was, because if you don't describe how it was before, then the change in itself is not so obvious. Yeah, yeah. Okay, all right. Let me just move on from here. Okay, so let's go into the actual writing of the story. Okay, right. One very important thing which many students don't really enjoy doing. I mean, I know, having taught for many years, right? They don't like to plan. Okay, but planning is actually an essential part of writing. Okay, um, so what do I mean by planning, right? So you can see here, right? A good composition has a beginning, middle, and end. There has to be a sequence of events, right? And if they don't think it out before the start of the story, they might end up getting stuck as they're writing the story, right? And then perhaps they feel that, oh, I have to start again. And that, of course, that takes a lot of time as well. Okay. So planning is actually essential. I think there's that saying, right? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail, basically. So planning is actually very, very important in any composition. Yeah. Now here, just look some examples of some of our journals at the Eden Academy, so you can see. So we use the 5 point story plan, basically the uh also known as the story mountain, right? So you got your beginning, your conflict, your middle, your resolution, and your end. So these are the different parts of the story, which before even writing, students should at least write one sentence or two sentences for each part so that they don't go off track, right? Spending that time on planning really will help. Okay. But of course, having said that, in an exam situation, you don't want to spend too long planning out your story. So I'll tell students typically you spend 5 to 7 minutes just thinking of your story idea, write down maybe a one sentence for each part of your story so that you know that this is your storyline. Okay, so this is something that all students should do. They should spend time planning before writing. Okay, so that's one very important point. Okay, now the other thing, of course, is because we want to make our stories interesting, the very first part of the story, the very start, should be starting off with a bang, right? Okay. There are many ways to start a story well. Okay. There are many different techniques. Okay. The very first sentence should be something great. So you can see in this example here, right? The thunder cracked overhead as I stepped onto the broken bridge. So immediately there's this sense uh of uh like a foreboding scene, right? There's thunder, you're stepping onto a broken bridge, there's a bit of danger perhaps, huh? So that first line will hook the reader, right? The reader wants to find out what is going to happen next. Is this person gonna fall off the bridge or hurt himself, so this is something very important. Starting is actually one of the most important things in a story, okay, is to hook the reader. Right. Again, as I said, there are many different ways to start. Okay. So one example here, again, all this, what you're seeing here comes from our journals at the Ethan Academy, right? So another way is to start in the middle of the action. Basically, straight away, there's something going on, right? There's some excitement going on, right? In one of the stories that we use here called the Graveyard Book, right? It starts like this, right? There was a hand in the darkness and it held a knife. Wow, that adds a lot of suspense here. A knife. Okay, what's going to happen here, right? And then of course they go on to tell the rest of the story. Yeah. So middle of the action. There's also another way which we use, which is called character snapshot. Now this is very useful because right at the start you're describing a little about the character. Okay, and when you do that, you're actually adding interest to the characters in the story, which is really important. I'll talk about that a little more as well. All right. When we write stories and we talk about characters, the reader wants to know about the character, right? Many students, when they're writing, they just think of a name and they think that's enough already, right? The Tom or Sally or whoever it may be, right? But they don't really tell the reader much about these characters. So spending time to develop characters is actually very important. And as I said, one good way of starting a story is to immediately talk about the character, right? So in this example here, Bradley Chalker sat at his desk in the back of the room, last seat, last row. No one sat at the desk next to him or at the one in front of him. He was an island. So straight away, I know about this boy. He's a loner, right? No one really mixes with him, right? Why? Is there something wrong with him, right? So this really adds interest to the character in the story. Okay, so that's another great way to start using a character snapshot. And of course, we have the sensory language where you describe the setting, right? Yeah, what you see, what you hear, maybe what you even smell or taste. So that's using sensory language, right? Usually you're describing the weather, yeah? Okay, so once you've got a good start, right? Now we have to develop the plot, which is actually the bulk of the story, isn't it? Right. So as I alluded to earlier, good stories actually build their characters. So um, we need to make sure our characters are developed, right? Characters, personalities, decisions, emotions, right? These are the things that drive the plot. Okay. So when students understand that they need to actually develop their characters, naturally the story will add will have more value because the reader would want to find out, will be more invested in the character. Because if they know nothing about the character, they probably won't be interested to find out what happens next to this character, right? Just imagine watching a movie and you just see someone doing something, but you don't know anything about this person. Then why would you even care what this person is doing, right? So the same thing goes for the, writing stories, yeah? Okay. Yeah, as mentioned on the slide here, right? When readers care about the characters, they'll care about what happens next. Yep. Okay, so some examples here again. How do we develop characters? Basically, you can talk about the three A's, right? The appearance, the actions, and the attitude. So what the character looks like, uh, actions, what they do, and attitude, right? So how do they feel about things, about certain things? How do they behave, right? Is this character a very arrogant person? Is this character a very timid person, right? So from these attributes, uh, that determines how this person will act as well. So again, all this really adds value to the story because you know that this shy character will find it very hard to go up on stage to give a speech, for example, right? Compared to someone who's very bold, right? So that's why it's important that students think about their characters as well. Yeah. Okay, so an example here, right? Instead of simply writing, Liam ran through the woods, consider why Liam is running. Is he chasing something? Is he escaping from something? Is he hoping to prove himself? Okay, so again, the motivations of the characters would add a lot of richness to the story. Okay, so developing characters, something very, very important. That's one way to actually add interest to your story. Okay, and then another way to develop the plot is this very important technique that most schools will teach, which is called show not tell or show don't tell. Okay, so again, instead of just telling the reader, right, how a character feels, show it through actions, thoughts, and dialogue. Okay, so this is again a very useful tool, a useful technique to develop a story. So just when we talk about story development, this is definitely one way to do that, right? Okay, so for example, telling, right? If you want to tell the reader that Sarah was nervous, you can just simply tell it that way. But that's very short, very direct, right? Instead, we can show. So how do we show? We can describe the actions, right? Sarah's hands tremble as she reached for the door handle, her breath shallow and quick. So immediately when you read these two sentences, you know which one is better. You know which one is going to add more interest to your story, which is definitely the showing sentence, not the telling sentence, right? So this technique really adds depth and emotion to your writing. It's a very useful technique to practice. Not to say that we can't use telling sentences, we can, but definitely we need to use showing sentences to develop ideas better. Okay. All right. So again, other techniques that we cover in our journals at Eton Academy. So the show not tell, things like internal dialogue, normal dialogue, sensory language, similes, metaphors. So these are all the different techniques that will help to build a story. It will help to develop the plot. Okay, let's move on from here. Okay, now another thing that we also try to do to enhance a story to develop the main ideas in a story is this thing called slow motion, right? So what is slow motion? Slow motion is basically when we want to um, focus on a particular action. And obviously, this action is going to be an important part of the story, right? Okay, we slow it down, right? We describe every single detail to add a bit of tension, to add a bit of to add a bit of excitement to the story. Yeah. So, for example, let's say the story is about someone going up to give a speech, but she or he is very, very nervous. Then just moving up the stage itself can be as if it's a, it's like a slow motion event, every single step the character takes is terrifying for him or her because he or she is so nervous, right? So that's what I mean by slow motion, right? Again, if you watch a movie, sometimes certain scenes they make it into slow motion. Yeah, and obviously these are the scenes that are important to the story, right? So the same thing for writing, right? So how do you do that? We add lots of detail to every single part of that action sequence, as it were. Okay, so that's another way to actually expand on your ideas. Yeah. Okay. Another thing that we do is to use dialogue, right? Now, dialogue is really important, and I think that sometimes students forget that if you're writing about a character, you should give the character a voice, right? So when you say give the character a voice, basically the words that he or she uses, right? That's his voice, that's her voice. That definitely adds a lot of interest as well. I mean, we talked about building characters just now, so dialogue is very important, right? So in this example here, right? Um, I can't believe you did that, Tom whispered, his eyes wide with shock. So by just including that piece of dialogue there, it shows how much in disbelief Tom was, right? And then further on, doing a show not tell description, eyes wide, right? Eyes wide with shock, right? So it again it adds a lot to the character and how the character is feeling. Yeah. Another thing that students need to think about, and this is probably one of the quickest things that they can do, right? Even after today, right? They can start doing this, which is to use precise vocabulary. Okay, simple basic words, things like good, nice, bad. These are all very basic words, which at this point in time in P5 or P6, they should not use already. They should think of more specific words, okay? Stronger words, right? So instead of good, you can use words like fantastic, right? Immediately that elevates your writing, right? Instead of bad, you can use or bad or sad, you can use miserable, right? So once again, once you use these words, right, immediately your writing is better. Yeah. Uh, Words like eerie, bustling. So these words really can enhance your child's writing. So what I suggest is that um as a form of checking, perhaps, after writing a story, look for all these simple words and think of a more precise word, something that is more specific. Instead of saying run, you can use words like dashed, raced. These words immediately the writing is so much better. Okay, and these are not difficult words, right? These are just more precise words, which your child needs to think about, right? Okay, so some examples from our journals. So we do that. We spend some time talking about specific vocabulary in various forms. Sometimes we do a lot of brainstorming, even in the form of word searches and things like that. Okay, the next thing about developing the plot. Now, if you notice, developing the plot is really quite a few things because that's the main part of the story, right? And when we say how do we um uh develop our ideas, this is what we're talking about, right? Okay, varying sentence structure. Okay, so again, if sentences are written all in a very similar way, it becomes very hard to read, right? So one way of overcoming this is to make sure there's a mixture of short sentences, longer sentences, right? The way you start your sentences can be different, right? It can't always start the same way, right? So that's also will add interest to the story and it makes it a lot easier for reading, right? Okay. For example, the room was silent. A single candle flickered in the corner, casting dancing shadows across the walls as the wind howled outside. Okay, so again, a mixture of short sentences, also the way they describe what was going on, okay, makes it a lot more interesting. right? Short and long sentence. Okay, now we have moved on to the ending, right? So for the ending, it's also very important that the story ends well. In fact, I mean, you can argue that it's as just as important as the starting, right? Okay. Obviously, we don't want to let the story just start abruptly, right? Think about what the character has learned or how the character has changed. Okay. So there are different ways to end a story. Okay, it could be a reflection, it could be a lesson learned, right? Something like that. I think many students always fall back on a lesson learned. But I always tell students as well that it really depends on your story because in the story, perhaps the character did all the right things. So there isn't really a lesson to learn. So perhaps in that sense, a reflection might be more appropriate. Okay. So I think the again, the student needs to think about what kind of ending they want to use, right? And again, the story must be complete. So there shouldn't be any loose ends at the end of the story because this is just a composition. It's a very short story. There's no continuation. Okay, so some students they like to end off with a bit of a like a mystery. It's like what's going to happen next. I advise against that because in a composition it has to be complete. Okay, so that's something to think about. Okay, so just very quickly, some ways to end a story. Thoughts, feelings, or motivation. So again, they end with how the character feels, what they're thinking of, and perhaps even what kind of motivations they have to for the future, right? What are they going to do in the future after this incident, right? So when they reflect, they have to also always reflect on the incident itself, the main part of the story itself. Yeah. Lesson learned. This is the next way of ending a story, something very, very common again. Usually, perhaps they go through an experience where they didn't know or they didn't know or they did the wrong thing, right? And then in the end, they learned something really important through this experience. Okay. So again, we have lots of examples from these are actually very known books. These books are all award-winning books, which we use in our curriculum at the Eden Academy, in case you're wondering. Yeah. Okay, you can also end with a memory. So when we say a memory, basically you're thinking about an important part in the story, something that you remember the most uh, from that whole story. This is actually useful to focus on a particular event, and that event should definitely relate to the theme of the story. Okay, so that's another way of ending a story itself. So again, there are many, many ways to end a story, different techniques. Okay, now, important point here as well. Ending can also reflect the theme of your story. In fact, I will recommend that the words used in the theme are also used in the ending of the story. Okay, so let's say, for example, the story is about friendship. Okay, you can show how character values their friend more than before, right? So, for example, you can say something like this: Lily smiled as she helped Max up from the muddy ground. Best friends always stick together, she said, and this time she really meant it. So again, friendship. So they use what? So the word friend is used, right? And of course, the action of helping the friend. So this reminds the reader again that this story is actually about friendship, which was the theme of the story. Okay, so similarly, whatever the theme might be, if you can use the words or use synonyms of the words used in the theme right at the end, that really will help the reader be brought back to the theme of the story. Okay, so that's a good tip for students to remember as well. Right? Okay. Now, the next thing, of course, is after writing the story, students need to spend time to check, right? Okay, most of the time, after the first draft, there will be some errors made, and this is very common, right? But if you read it again, you might be able to pick up some of these things even before the teacher looks at it. Okay, so always reread your work. Look for how to improve, right? Okay, check, make sure your ideas are clear. Are there words that you can improve upon, right? So I talked about precise verbs earlier. Are there words you can change to make it more interesting? Right? Are there any more details that you can add in as well? Okay, so even the small edits sometimes can really make a big difference. Okay, okay, so to summarize, right, a very powerful composition is one that is planned well, planned thoughtfully, starts with an impact, develops characters, all right? Um, Also all those different ways to we can actually expand on ideas, right? Ends with some sort of meaning, and of course, edited in the end, right? Just do a quick check. Generally, if it's in an exam situation, give yourself about, again, 5 to 7 minutes at least of checking, okay? Because more often than not, you'll be able to spot the errors that you actually make, especially when it comes to things like spelling or tenses, right? These are the common things that you can pick out on your own as well as students, right? Okay, that really is comes to the end of the webinar for today. At the Eden Academy, we do have a promotion going on right now. So it's $200 off the first term's fee for new students, right? So you can actually scan the quick response code right there, which will lead you to our landing page to find out more as well. Yep. So I hope you have benefited from this short sharing session. Feel free to ask questions. You can type in the chat. If you have any questions, please do so. I'll try my best to answer. If not, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. And well, hopefully I'll see you at one of our centers soon. All right. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat and I'll definitely try to answer them right now. Okay, I have one question here asking how do you make sure that we're not out of point and the best way to show we are following the topic. So again, very important. Once you've read the theme, um, the words in the theme are important, right? So for example, let's say learning something new, like in last year's PSLE, right? That is something that you must make sure that you break down what it means. It means something that you've not done before, right? So the story must focus on the fact that this is a new activity. Okay. So one thing I tell the students is this, as they are planning their story, always go back to the theme. Make sure that in their plan, it is definitely answering what the theme is asking. Okay. Um, Having said that as well, the picture mentioned just now is very important. So the picture, you must revolve around the picture. Okay. So choosing the pictures is also very, very important to showcase what is this new activity, right? So I think one of the pictures was a campfire, right? So again, if they will choose that one, then to make sure that they have to include that they have not done that before is a brand new activity to them. Okay, just by pointing these things out, it shows you already aligned with what the question is. And again, the other thing I mentioned is about the ending, right? Bring it back at the end. Talk about use the words in the theme right at the end of the story. So that way you can more or less be certain that your story is aligned with the theme. Okay, so I hope that that helps. Again, it really depends on the question itself, and understanding the question is very important. Now, usually they won't give you a theme which is so difficult to understand, right? So I think that from that regard, I think it's okay. They are not there to purposely make it difficult for your child. Yeah. So the words in the theme, just break it down, understand, make sure you use some of the words in the theme in the story. Okay, that should be good. Yeah. Okay. If there are any other questions, please you feel free to ask them in the chat or in the Q&A. Okay. I got an interesting question here. What if there are two climaxes? How to guide your child? Okay. Um, all right. When it comes to writing compositions, I always advise students to focus on uh one climax. Like the climax is like the most exciting part of the story, right? Now, I also understand that there's a technique called a double climax, right? Whereby the first exciting thing happens and then it kind of like drops off, then suddenly something else happens, right? I would advise that technique only for very good writers because if there's more than one climax, sometimes when when you're so excited to write all these exciting things happening, right? Again, it loses a bit of focus, right? So my advice would be focus on the main climax. What is the most exciting part of the story? What happened then? And then after that, go into your resolution. Think about how the problem or how the conflict is solved. Okay. But again, if your child is a very good writer, then perhaps they can think of a double climax, which is I would say an advanced way of advanced tech writing technique. Yeah, yeah. So yes, I think focus on the main climax. Don't think about adding a second one. I know sometimes shown they always lots of ideas and then they want to include everything, right? So again, just focus on the main one. That would be my advice. Yeah. Okay. All right. Is there any other questions? Please feel free to put it in the Q&A. Okay, one more question here. What about overusing fancy vocab? Yes, that's the other thing, right? So that's why earlier on I mentioned that it's not a good idea to just memorize all the different good phrases because sometimes when you overuse it, it sounds very unnatural. Okay. I think when it comes to fancy vocabulary, okay, I would rather not use the term fancy here. I would rather use the term precise. So as I said earlier, right? So you definitely some words, some bigger words, if your child is able to use them, that's good. But again, use them in context. Um, Sentences do not need to be complex for writing to be good. Okay, good writing just means that readers can follow it, and readers are interested to read on, right? So things like varying sentence structure, as I mentioned earlier, it makes it a lot easier for readers to read. It doesn't mean that big words are constantly used. If you keep using big words, then again, it might hamper the understanding of the reader and it slows the reading down. So what I would say is use more precise words. Use words that add lots of meaning to the story. Okay, as opposed to just using big words for the sake of using big words, right? So that is, if you notice, good writers, right? They don't really usually do that. Yeah. Okay. I have another question here. Will they give more marks when you write more vocabulary? Okay, so again, this is about using different techniques. So like idioms, yes, you definitely can use idioms, but at the same time, you don't want to use an idiom, you know, every two or three sentences. Then it becomes very unnatural, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah. Knowing idioms and using appropriate ones in the right time at the right time will work. Okay, so typically when it comes to sayings, comes to idioms and things like that, I would advise students not to use more than two or three in the whole story because then it might seem very unnatural. Yeah. In fact, sometimes using one is good enough. Yeah, maybe it could be an idiom at the end of the story to encapsulate what the story was about. Okay, so that would work very well. Okay, if you overuse something, then it becomes very unnatural. Then the reader or the marker might feel that, oh, this person is just feeding in idioms all the way, which will have a reverse effect, right? An adverse effect, I would say. One more question here. Will abrupt conclusion lose a lot of marks? Okay, so endings, as I mentioned earlier, very important. If you end abruptly, what that means probably is that number one, the student didn't have enough time to finish the story, or number two, the student couldn't think of a good way to end the story. Now, in both situations, it means in both situations, um, the marker will feel that the student either didn't plan well or couldn't think of a good story. It does mean that they will lose content marks. Okay, when you say a lot of marks, it's a bit hard to say, but definitely if the conclusion is abrupt, your child will not be able to get the top bands already. Okay, because it will seem as if it's an incomplete story. Mm. Okay. Right. I got another interesting question here. Can we use cliffhangers at the end of the compo? Okay. So this is something that I kind of mentioned a bit earlier about how, like, if you end a story, but it leaves the reader to think about what's going to happen next. It really depends on how uh how the cliffhanger is written. Okay. My advice is not to do that because again, it is a composition. It should be a complete story. We don't want to leave the reader guessing, okay? But if let's say the whole story is completed, you or the student has written what has happened to every character mentioned in the story, maybe even like how they feel in the end. Um, a way of ending it could be that perhaps uh saying something like, oh, who knows what else this character might get into next time, for example. I mean, that's okay. But as far as a cliffhanger, when I think of cliffhanger, I think of like when you like movies, for example, where there's a part two or part three. But we don't want that for compositions because there's only one story which they need to end, right? So I really advise students not to use a cliffhanger. Yeah, that's my advice. Okay, any other questions that you may have? Okay, I think that should be all. Okay, I think that should be all. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for attending this afternoon. And as I said, hopefully I'll see you at one of our centers soon. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. Have a good afternoon yourselves. Okay. Bye.